Hello and welcome to an endgame study video. We'll be going over two king and pawn endgames that are very fascinating once you see the solution. They're very unintuitive. This is the first one here that we'll be looking at. If you want to try to solve this on your own, uh, the white pawns are going up the board and the black pawns are going down. So yeah, feel free to pause the video and then we'll check the solution. Initially, it might seem like this is a completely winning position for black because no matter what white plays, the black pawn will just go down, and whenever white tries to push their pawn, then the black king will stop it, right? But there's one detail here. You have to use your king to essentially try to catch this pawn and escort your own pawn, right? So the first move here is king to g7. Uh, let's say you try any other move instead. Let's say you play c7. Well, the black king will stop you, right? You can't promote. If you promote, then black takes your pawn, and basically their pawn will promote. So pushing the pawn immediately doesn't work. And like we just saw, if you try to chase the pawn, it's too slow because it's way ahead of your king, right? And then if you try to go this way to now escort your pawn, right, it's too late. Black gets a queen and you're not in time, right? So the first move is king to g7. Let's see what happens if black tries to immediately stop your pawn, right? It's the same idea. If you push your pawn, they take it and their pawn is too far, right? But white will play king f6, simultaneously getting closer to this pawn and to their own pawn. So by going diagonally like this, you're in a single move, you're getting closer to both pawns, right? That's the concept in this puzzle. So if black pushes their pawn now, you'll do the same thing. King to e5, getting one step closer to this pawn and your own pawn, right? So if black pushes now, of course, you don't want to keep following it because you're too far. Now you can't stop it, right? But now once the pawn gets too far, now your king can help your pawn. And now once black pushes their pawn, you push yours. If they get a queen, you get a queen. And it's a draw, right? If in this position, black tries to stop it, right? Then you help your pawn once again. And now they have to get a queen, and you get a queen as well with check, and it's a draw, right? Queen versus queen. So that's what happens in this variation. If after over here, they push their pawn, right? Now your king helps it. If in this position they take your pawn, well now all of a sudden, because you went diagonally like this, your king is close enough to the pawn to stop it, right? And you're just in time. So that's sort of what happens after king f6. And of course, if black takes the pawn right here, then you can right away win the pawn. So the trickiest line here is after over here. It's kind of the same thing. If black blocks your pawn instead, then again, you can run towards their pawn and stop it. So if we go back to the beginning here, king to g7 is the only move, because if you go, let's say, king to h7, it might seem like it accomplishes the same thing, but it actually doesn't, because your king now is one square too far away from your pawn. So you have to go king to g7 to get close to both pawns, right? If king to h7, if we do the same thing, now you're too far, right? And we'll go one more variation here. If black decides to just push their pawn without trying to stop your pawn, then what happens is you keep going diagonally up to this point. And once the pawn gets to h3, then instead of your king going to e5, you go either to e7 or e6 to help your pawn, right? And now you push your pawn, you force black's king to stop it, and then now you help it, right? It's the same thing, because if if they don't, if you push your pawn, then they get a queen, you get a queen, right? It's a draw. And if here, right, they stop it this way, then you help it, and then you get queens at the same time. So that's the gist of this puzzle, is that at the beginning you have to go diagonally to a specific point. If black keeps pushing their pawn, then you go to help your pawn promote. And if the black king goes towards your pawn, then they essentially wasted a move trying to stop your pawn, and now you're in time to stop black's pawn because they spent a move with their king instead of spending a move moving their pawn forward, right? And likewise, if they spend those moves just moving the pawn forward, then your king had more time to get close to your pawn to help your pawn, right? So I hope you like this concept. We'll be going over one more puzzle which utilizes the same kind of pattern and the same kind of idea. So this is the position. It's white to play and draw. So the white pawns are going up, black pawns are going down. So again, it might seem like white is completely losing here because white only has one pawn, black has three. And from what we know in king and pawn endgames, right, is if one side has more pawns, then almost always they'll be winning, right? In addition, black's king is so close to this pawn, and although white's king is close to these pawns, there's three connected passed pawns, which are impossible to stop for the king, right? So we have to somehow use that concept of getting close to our own pawn while still stopping these, right? So let's go through the moves that don't work first. So of course, if you push your pawn right away, then king stops it and you lose the pawn, and the three pawns your king will not be able to stop. So, and let's see, if you go king g4 here, then black will play g6. Now your king can't approach any of the pawns, and basically now black's king can stop your pawn, and no matter what you play, they take your pawn and you're down three pawns, right? So if you can't move backwards, you can't push the pawn, then we only have really one move, right, which is king to g6. So after king to g6, let's see what happens when black tries to stop your pawn immediately, right? What will happen is you take this pawn. If they take your pawn right away, you take on f6, not h6, because then their king can defend their pawn on f6, right? But you take on f6, and now your king is close to the pawn, and it's going to be a draw, right? So that's what happens if they try to take the pawn right away with their king. So if that doesn't work for black, let's say they try to push their outside pawn, right? What white's going to do is take the chain of the pawn chain, right? The base. They take on g7, and now let's say black keeps pushing the h pawn. Now this position is actually the same as the previous puzzle, right? We're going to take here and use this technique where the king goes diagonally and tries to stop this pawn whilst also defending your own, right? So that's what happens after h4, right? If black plays f5 here, then it's the same thing. We go king to f6, just as if this pawn was not here, but in this case, we're chasing the f pawn instead of the h pawn. So after king to f6, if black plays h4, then again, we go here, h3, and we help the pawn, right? Here, you push the pawn. If they push, we push ours, and we each get queen, and then we can take the pawn, right? And here, that's what happens after h4. If black plays f4 instead, then it's the same thing. We have king to e5, essentially attacking this pawn. If we win this pawn, then it's a draw because this pawn is too close to our king, right? And we can win it. So king to e5, we're getting closer to this pawn, and also getting closer to defending our own, right? So if king to b6, we can take the pawn, and now it's a draw. If they push the pawn, now all of a sudden we help the pawn, right? Now we're ready to push the pawn. f2, we push, and we get a queen at the same time. And despite black having an extra pawn here, this is theoretically a draw, because eventually white will be able to win this pawn. And if they don't, then white's king is closer to black's pawn than black's king, so it's a known draw. So that's the gist of it, is to try to take this g7 pawn to get into the same sort of position as the previous puzzle, right? There's one more detail here. If black, after king to g6, if black tries to play f5, which is perhaps the best way to try to win, we're still going to take on g7 and use this diagonal technique to catch the pawns, right? So if they keep pushing the pawn, we don't take this, right? Because now they can push and their king is close to our pawn and our king is too far, right? We would go diagonally again like this if they push. Now we have to know not to go king to e5, because now the pawn is too slow, right? They get a queen and we're not in time. We don't promote fast enough. So only when the pawn gets too far, now we go king to e6 and push the pawn, threaten to queen. So if they queen, right, then we queen as well. And if they stop again with king b7, then king to d7, helping the pawn, right? They're gonna queen and we queen, right, with check. So they don't have time to somehow trade queens and then push their pawn, right? So that's the final detail, which is f5. The best try to win for black is still not enough because of this technique of taking the base and then going diagonally to try to win the f pawn. And then if you win the f pawn, then this pawn is on the edge and it's too close to our king to try to promote. So yeah, that's the end of these studies. I really hope you enjoyed seeing this insane endgame and found it incredible. Like when I saw this study the first time, I was just amazed. Like how can this be a draw, right? Black has 3 pawns, and you know how can you stop connected pawns? And you only have 1, but black's king is so close, right? So I found it amazing. So yeah, I hope you did too. Thank you very much for watching.